In this lesson, we'll design the canopy tower and consider the general circulation around the building. So first of all, let's go ahead and have a look at this sphere that we have on top here. Now the sphere element is essentially another source object that we're going to be using to derive other shapes. And we've already used it when planning our little abstracted branches here, and we're using it as well to create that depression that we had done a few lessons earlier. So what I'd like to do right now is to have a look at how this canopy will be done, and what I think would be quite interesting is to have a partially steel structure and then have a few of the panels done in a type of LED mesh or something that could be colored or quite interesting to look at from the surroundings as we walk around the building. So we want to have something look quite interesting so that people can really take note of the building as if it wasn't already loud enough. So let's go ahead and create a copy again of our sphere, and I'm going to isolate out that copy, but I'm just going to keep one of these branches within the selection. So next I'm going to add an editable poly modifier, and pretty much you'll start to see that the process that I'm using is quite similar to what I do with everything else. And that is as well another speed modeling tip, is that if you always repeat the same process and get very different results, because that process will be quite rich in terms of what it can provide for you, you will be able to really speed up your workflow amazingly, because you will not have to think about many different types of workflows that are completely different. Once you get really comfortable doing something, keep repeating it and you'll be speeding up every single time you do it. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to imagine that this is now my structure, and I'm going to create another copy of that, and I'm going to now go and delete a few of the panels that I don't want to have seen. So what I'm doing now is just creating a random arrangement of panels, and these are the ones that I'm going to be keeping. So let's just go ahead and finish this whole dome element. I'm just going to work through until I get to the other side, back to where I started. So the panels that I'm deselecting are the ones that I'm going to keep, and the panels that are red are the ones that are going to be deleted as soon as I've completed it. So this can obviously be done in any way. I'm just choosing this method because it's going to look a little bit interesting on our facade. So now that my selection is finished, I'm going to hit delete on the keyboard, and I can now take this object which is completed, the one that's full, and I can add a lattice modifier onto that, just as we had done before. So the radius here can be 0.06, let's say, so quite a thin structure, and I can also make sure that within object properties I'm actually viewing the whole thing at 100% visibility. So if that is correct, I can also type Alt X, and that's just going to unghost that object. So these panels that are on the inside, those are going to be now textured separately. And I also need to make sure here that my object properties is at 1. So I'm going to keep them translucent for now, just so that I can still see through the object. And for the sphere element itself, I believe that I don't need that anymore. So I can just move it onto the hidden source object layer, and that will then just expose and better show what is remaining. So the next thing that I can start thinking about is the circulation up the building. Now, if I unhide the space frame layer, we can start to see what that looks like. And also I can just delete this object because it was one of the source objects for the underside of that space frame. So the outer box I'm still going to keep. That's the last remaining source object, the one I've just lifted up. We're going to be using that in the next lesson to derive part of our floor slabs and ceilings, but I can also use a space frame itself, but we'll get to that in the next lesson. What I want to look at right now is how the stairs that we modeled recently are going to be getting us up to the top of this building. Now, I thought originally that the stairs would take us up to the height of this roof, and then we would have a bridge element, but I think it would be quite interesting to end those stairs much lower down, and then just to have external stairs pulling us up, because I think keeping this whole sphere open and not interrupted with bridges sticking out of it would be much more pure in its representation. So I'm going to now go to this bridge element, and I'm going to go to my spiral stair, and I'm just going to reduce that overall height, locking down the riser height but reducing the total height to be much lower. So I'm going to take it down roughly till about there, which I believe to be the top of that space frame. So I'm going to have a look at where it's ending up. And the top of that tread is more or less over here. So if I go into this tower, you can imagine that you would arrive up. I can perhaps increase this to 0.8 or perhaps 12 meters. And we would get to this top tread, and then from there we would step out onto a platform and then go up through an external staircase up the slope of this roof, and then we would basically arrive at our roof platform. So I'm not going to model any of the other smaller stairs because I believe that from the scale that we'll be viewing this, we're not going to see it. I'm not going to waste time. Remember that this is a speed modeling course, and one of the big tricks to getting that speed modeling right is not to harbor on the small details that we'll hardly ever see. Now already the internal spiral staircase is a small detail, but it is quite an important element, especially if we want to do any arrival shots where we do actually start seeing through. Now I'm going to as well have a look at the internal circulation. So I'm going to now select the top space frame. Now this is where it starts getting a little bit complicated, and perhaps this won't be seen, but let's just go and do it anyway. What's happening is that once we arrive at the level of the main expo floor, we need to move through the space frame. So by depressing it downwards, we've created a huge design obstacle because we need to now penetrate through this as we walk backwards and forwards. Remember that we'll have one space on this side where the auditorium will be, and the main expo space will be this freeform space around the outside. So we need to think about how to do that. So let's go ahead and select some of these objects, isolate them out, and let's also remove the lattice modifiers so that we can better see what we are working with. So essentially what we need is to now create an entrance portal on both sides of this main arrival tower. So I'm going to add another editable poly modifier, and I'm simply going to go in and delete some of these polys. Now remember, when you do things like this, you're also messing with the actual structure of the building. So all of this would have to be consulted with an engineer who would understand the implications of doing something like cutting holes out of a space frame. Space frames essentially have their strength through the fact that everything is acting in unison, and once you start cutting holes out of it, it really defeats the point. But we also do know that we have to somehow work between a design and a structure. So very often things like this can be compensated for by adding extra structural steel around this portal and working around the fact that you need to have this portal as a design element. So I'm just keeping you aware of those things. So next you can go and add more editable poly modifiers to the actual staircase element. So we can go in and work on that same editable poly modifier if you like and create more vertices, just in the same way that we had created vertices down here for this entrance, and we can basically slide this down to that floor level. And I can create another set of vertices by connecting those edges once again, and then bringing this down to the correct height. As I'm doing this, I should also be quite mindful of what height that's going to be. So let's use the tape and let's just measure out. And we can see that's about 3.7 meters. So that's definitely high enough to create an entrance. And I'm going to now, within that left view, just cut out this entire portal out of that screen. So I'm going to just take all of these elements. Let's look at that in perspective. So essentially we'll be deleting the screen element over there, so we create a nice entrance for ourselves as we go through this tower. Now the last thing that I can quickly go and edit as well is this spiral staircase. Once we get to the point where we want to exit off it, we will need to create a landing platform. So let's go and isolate that as well. Here we have our tower, and we can see that there's a small distance to be covered to go and basically exit out of the building. So here let's go and add another editable poly modifier, and I'm simply going to look in my side view, take the stairs that need to be created on top of the landing, and just with a central point, in other words, the transform coordinate center needs to be somewhere in the middle of the staircase. So let's just go and move that for ourselves. Let's go and basically affect that. Make sure that that's in the middle of your stair. And then once you go and basically rotate it, you will be able to rotate it around the center, being the point that is in the center of the spiral stair. So I'm going to move it now by about 90 degrees. I'm going to let's turn on my angle snap by pressing A, and I'm going to have a 90-degree difference there. So what I've basically created is this space for myself, and I can now create a landing platform here. So this is one of those areas, again, where you don't necessarily want to waste time modeling that, but if you absolutely have to do an internal view of that spiral staircase, then go ahead and do it. But I, in most cases, won't bother with those small details. But here we can start to see what we've been working on. So again, with the external structure here, you will want to think about how you want to move out of it. So you may want to punch out a few more portals so that you can get out of the actual cone at that higher level. So anyhow, I've already showed you most of what I want to do in this lesson, which is basically working on the source geometry of the sphere and editing the space frame structure even more, adding more editable polymodifiers, as well as editing the spiral stair. Now, one more tiny thing that I can have a look at is, for example, if you're not happy with how this looks in terms of the circulation, in terms of its organic format, you could also remove the mesh smoothing, and you can just see how very quickly you can make render options of both organic and linear types of circulation for that. So it's also very good to have those modifiers that you can just turn on and off and have those different designs to compare. So that brings us to the end of this lesson. We're going to now look at completing the building by adding the floors and the ceilings, and then straight after that, in the lesson that follows, we're going to be looking at the materials and later on the actual render.